Welcome back to The Odds Against Us, a podcast focused on gambling awareness and prevention. I'm your host, Connor, and today I'm joined by another special guest, Liz Parsons. Liz, why don't you start by telling us a little more about yourself?
Hi, Connor. Thanks for having me. My name is Liz
No problem.
Parsons. I have been working in substance use prevention for over 20 years in the Boston area and the outskirts, with a primary focus and passion for preventing alcohol use among youth. Right now, I work for the town of Wakefield, but in the past, I've worked in Boston with youth to ban alcohol ads on the MBTA.
Cool. You mentioned that you've had some experience, with the banning alcohol ads. So maybe if you want to dive a little more into the specifics, or what type of problem you saw there, and how you went about addressing that.
Sure. So we know from years of prevention science that the more alcohol ads kids see, the more likely they are to drink. That's the primary purpose of marketing and advertising, is to get people to use a product more. And so in Boston, youth, I think it was initially a group of youth from Dorchester, recognized the incredible amount of alcohol advertising on the T when they were riding the T to school every day. And that movement to address that issue grew to a statewide initiative called Supporting an Alcohol-Free Environment, Massachusetts, or SAFE-MA. And I worked with both South Boston youth and then Allston Brighton youth for several years to work towards getting rid of the alcohol ads on the T and getting rid of that youth exposure. We were super fortunate to have an alcohol researcher at Boston University at the time who was doing research on advertising on alcohol and actually used the MBTA and the student ridership as their data points. And so we had data, specific to Boston, specific to youth, and could see how many times youth were bombarded with alcohol ads every day, which was basically their school bus, riding the T every day to and from school. So, from that campaign, we several youth coalitions and youth groups across Boston and even in some of the suburban coalitions joined efforts to try to get the ads removed. And they did that in multiple ways. So when you're looking toward a policy change, like an alcohol ad policy at the T, you want to look at it in terms of where are the policy levers, where are the places that you need to, where can change happen, and who's going to influence that change. So who's in direct control of that change, like who has the power to make that, say, yep, we're going to ban them, and then who's going to influence that person or that body who makes that decision. And so the youth groups mobilized and accessed all of their sort of the resources, and also worked in a bunch of different spaces. So one, they worked with the legislature. There was a representative at the time in the state legislature who had a bill in the legislature to ban alcohol ads on the T. So there was a legislative angle in that sense. There's also the MBTA organization itself. It's kind of a quasi-public organization. At the time, it had a board of directors or board who was making decisions, and a general manager who carried out those decisions. And then you could also look to the city of Boston itself. Now, they had no control over the MBTA, but they did have control over bus shelters, which was also an issue. There were a lot of alcohol ads on bus shelters. And so the youth were kind of working these three different policy lever angles, and was, I've done a whole hour and a half webinar on lessons learned and the whole process of how we got this done. But essentially, it was a lot of, somebody being in the right place at the right time. It was a general manager who was very open to hearing from the youth and saying, yes, this is an issue and I support it and let's make it happen. It was a fortuitous meeting on an airplane between two very influential policymakers who had a conversation about it and supported the youth through their work. But the crux of it, really, and the huge success was the youth voice and the youth sharing their experiences on the T, their data collection. I mean, yes, we had this alcohol researcher with stacks of research about all the reasons why it's not a good idea to expose youth to ads in that way. But we also had stacks of signed petitions asking the T to get rid of them. We had youth testimonials. They showed up at the board of directors meetings and would make presentations. And So it ended up being, a few years. It wasn't done overnight, but it was a combination of the diligence of the youth and the passion, which is really and was and still is an equity issue, because Boston public school kids are disproportionately exposed, with ads on
Yeah.
the T, than our kids who are riding yellow school buses in the suburbs. And so that was, that their voice was and always will be the strongest and the most impactful in the room.
Yeah, I find that really interesting that you said like the youth were the main drivers in this
Mm-hmm.
fight against it. Do you think there's a specific reason why, like, I guess policymakers would listen to like a youth voice more than maybe an adult?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, I have some thoughts about it, but I want to know maybe what you think about that.
Well, some of the things that I've heard from policymakers is that they don't often hear from youth. And so that's
Hmm.
one of the things. Like, they will pay attention when a young person cares enough about a topic that's happening in their community, then they want to listen. The other thing we know is, in prevention work, we always look to the science, and we know that there is a lot of sort of social research around communication and substance use prevention, and in advancing alcohol policies. And one key piece of research that came out several years ago, even before we were, it was after we were doing this alcohol at work, is that who are the best messengers for substance use related issues. And they found that pediatricians and youth were the best messengers, most effective. Their
Yeah.
voices were the most effective and impactful when trying to educate people about what the issues or influence people's decisions or behavior. We saw that with flavored tobacco and nicotine products. Youth in Massachusetts were the drivers of that legislation, and that when youth got together and spoke up, that changed it. And that, as has or at the time had impacted the nation, with it being banned. But so it's both, the research says youth are the best and most impactful messages, and then messengers, and then we also hear anecdotally from our elected officials and from key decision makers how impactful messages from youth are. And I think as a prevention practitioner and an adult advisor to youth, it's our job to make sure that youth understand, like, learn what the science is, appreciate their role and how important it is, and help them build skills so that, whether it's public speaking or doing an elevator speech or knowing the science, or that kind of skill building and education, as well as sharing their lived experience. Like, what's it like to be a kid riding the T and seeing these alcohol ads? Like, what does that make you, how does that make you feel? What's your experience? How many do you pass on, how many ads do you see on your way to and from school? Whatever that might be, they're telling their personal story. So there's a combination in that message of, like, here's the science, here's the problem, here's my story, and here's what we know is an effective solution.
Yeah, I guess you mentioned how like the youth obviously are strongly against alcohol right on the ads or on their tea rides. Do you think there's a reason why there's so much, or do you? I guess how have you seen like the stigma around alcohol change? I guess over the years because obviously a lot of teenagers don't think it's like a big deal or obviously like to drink a lot and especially with gambling it's highly seen as in a good light rather than like a negative. So do you have any like strategies maybe to like obviously you had these group of youth come to you with the problem they saw, right? Yeah, so how would you say like you can maybe change the narrative around something like alcohol or gambling from like seen as a positive among these like youth social groups to more of a negative.
Well, you asked a few questions in that, but one thing, no,
Sorry.
it's okay. One thing I will say, I'll try to answer them all, is that we know that as soon as a substance is legalized, when it hasn't been, in your lifetime or whatever, there's a perception change of how harmful it is. Because if it's legal, then they'll think, oh, it must be okay. Like there's not a right.
Yeah.
So there's a perception change in the population already. And then it can differ, and the stigma differs by substance. So alcohol,
Okay.
there was a short stint where you had to be 18 in the United States. The age of alcohol right now is 21 plus to be able to purchase alcohol. But there was a brief stint, I think in the 70s, where it was 18. And then what happened is they saw drunk driving fatalities increase in that short period of time, which is one of the protective reasons why it's 21, because they just saw a lot of motor vehicle crashes involving alcohol when they lowered it. But anyway, so when you legalize a substance, the perception of harm, what we call the perception of harm, goes down. So you're already combating that, shift. And then you add on the advertising for it, because the advertising is now it's a commercial, it's a product, it's open to anything. And also there aren't those guardrails in advertising policy or, in regulations in place to protect youth from that advertising. Now, for example, when cannabis was recently legalized in Massachusetts, people would say, well, we're going to regulate it like alcohol. Not realizing, and not maybe realizing or, fully thinking that there are a lot of flaws in the way that we regulate alcohol. And there's constantly pushing up against the alcohol industry or lobbyists or, people with, good intentions to boost the economy, but not fully thinking about actually there are huge public health costs, both in lives and in money down the line if you make big shifts. So the intention when something is legalized is to regulate it. So making rules, having rules in place. But that's always, as soon as you regulate it, the brakes are off and the industry is in there marketing, whether it's gambling, as you've mentioned, whether it's cannabis, whether it's alcohol, they're in there. And it's really hard to push the brakes on after that's happened. Did you ask was there another question in that?
I think you covered it, but you mentioned like regulations. You know, what do you think worked? I guess, and then maybe one thing that worked and one thing that didn't during your advocacy.
For the alcohol ads specifically, or just in
Yeah,
general
yeah.
for those?
Or in general. I guess like tips that could be used for like
Yeah, yeah,
other sorts of fights is kind of what I'm looking for.
yeah, absolutely. So, to apply lessons learned from the work that I've done with youth and alcohol policies, to apply that to another area like gambling, I think one thing is what I've mentioned already is the youth involvement Making sure youth are educated about what the science is, what's the research say about gambling, advertising, and just in general gambling and the impact on youth health and well-being. And then also building those youth the skills for whether it's public speaking or an elevator pitch or public health science or sort of that background information and skill building. And then um, obviously if there's an adult advisor or an adult coalition, making sure that they are very well educated and trained and working with youth and helping guide them. Um, and uh, so that would be number one if you're working on youth advocacy towards an effort. The other piece is another thing that I mentioned is where are your levers of change. So for gambling, for example, who oversees gambling in Massachusetts? There's the Gambling Commission. There's the Attorney General's office has some oversight over aspects, and then and enforcement, I think, of regulations as well.
Yeah.
So that, I mean, we haven't even talked about enforcement. I mean, we talked about putting rules and regulation in place, but then once you put that in place, who's going to enforce it? Are they actually enforcing it? Are they enforcing it equitably? Like, there's a lot of follow up. If you are successful in getting a policy passed, there's a lot of or a guardrail or a safety law or feature. There's a lot of follow up to make sure that that's actually being done, because that's another whole sort of effort and piece. So anyway, train your youth and your adults to make sure they have everything they need. Identify those places where policy changes and effective ones can happen. And again, there's a whole other sort of webinar podcast about making policy changes and all the things that can go into that. Building a campaign of support, and of influence, and getting yourselves in front of those decision-making bodies, being a trusted resource for those decision makers to say, look, I've got this data research, we've got these youth voices, we've got these people who are ready to provide you with information about, the issue, and just kind of building that relationship with the decision makers as a trusted resource, and being consistent in your message and in your in that kind of relationship.
And then one thing that like maybe didn't go so well, or thing you would avoid.
So I think I touched upon it, the enforcement side of it. So in our work with prevention, and especially on sort of the workforce side of roles like mine, there can be a lot of turnover. And partly, I mean, that's, again, another whole topic, but, sometimes these jobs are not very well paid. The benefits aren't great. And a lot of people go into it with personal or lived experience, and it's hard work when you have that, and there may not be opportunities for promotion. And so there could be a lot of turnover is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And so an effort that I may have worked on years ago in Boston, would my successor in that role have had the same, approach, follow up? Would it be the same priority? Things could shift and priorities could shift. And so then the piece around enforcement, like, okay, we've passed the policy, but who's going to make sure that it actually stays that way? You have to continue that advocacy. You have to continue making sure. And then, leadership changes. You get new legislators all the time, right? You get, new boards of director, new members on the board or new general managers. And so that can threaten a new policy that may be in place. Yeah. So it's ongoing work. It's not a one and done. And yeah.
Yeah. I guess shifting to like what you're currently doing, how does like day to day look for you now? Are you still in the advocacy space? Maybe not with alcohol, or maybe you still are. I'm not not really sure, but maybe telling us a little more about, I guess, current up to date
Sure.
things you're working on.
Yeah. Well, right now, like I said in the beginning, I work for the town of Wakefield. So I'm the prevention, outreach, and youth services manager. So I'm not just a coalition director for a prevention coalition. There are a lot of other responsibilities in this particular role. But one of the things that I am still connected with is the Massachusetts Alcohol Policy Coalition, which is a volunteer coalition of prevention professionals across Massachusetts with who are working with youth, sometimes not, but working toward effective policy changes in their community. They also, so that's sort of local policies. So that could be anything that's within the control of a municipality. Sometimes there are state laws and state policies and laws that all municipalities just have to follow because it's a state law. But sometimes, a lot of cases, towns and cities have control over what they do locally. So we call it sort of like they call it little p policy and big P policy, is something that really impacts an entire state, or maybe something that impacts a smaller group of people. So the Massachusetts Alcohol Policy Coalition, or MAPC, has been meeting for several years now, and really it's a network, like I said, of prevention professionals, community and residents who are interested in working towards effective alcohol policy. Most recently, we've been doing a lot of education around affordability of alcohol, because we talked a little bit about advertising, but also the price of alcohol is hugely impactful when it comes to underage drinking, because youth are very price savvy consumers. And so the cheaper something is, the more, right, the easier it would be to get. And so if we simply raise the alcohol tax by like a dime a drink, we would cut underage drinking across the board in Massachusetts, because the price would be impacted just by a little bit. Now, also increasing an alcohol tax gives the state revenue, a ton of revenue. This alcohol tax in Massachusetts, I'm talking about the excise tax, not the sales tax. So sales tax is the tax at the point of sale that, you might get when you buy something now. But an excise tax is taxed at the wholesale level. So like the bulk alcohol that comes in to the state, the alcohol producers have to pay this tax on the volume of alcohol that they bring in. So simply raising that, and you did nothing with the revenue, it would make an impact on excessive alcohol use harms, and including underage drinking harms. But you take that revenue and you can do so much. You can raise billions for, you can give some to the general fund and have plenty left over for substance use prevention, for treatment, for education, for domestic violence prevention, for all the things that, that we talk about when we talk about alcohol harms, like people becoming addicted. Treatment services are so expensive. We spend more on treatment of alcohol use disorders than we do on prevention of alcohol use disorders. So that's costly. Domestic violence services. Dozens of people die in Massachusetts every year from domestic violence incidents. And no, I'm not saying alcohol causes domestic violence or vice versa, but there is a relationship there. It can exacerbate it, certainly. And so, revenue could go towards helping our domestic violence prevention partners, or suicide mental health partners. So tons of good and could be done with the revenue of an alcohol tax that hasn't been raised since Jimmy Carter was president. And I don't know if you've ever heard of Jimmy Carter, but it was like the 70s, it was, so I don't know how I got on affordability, but that's one of another key factor, in addition to advertising, that could make a huge difference if we just slightly increase the price.
I think that's interesting because, raising the price of alcohol, like the bulk scale would kind of help both parties in a way, from my understanding of it.
Would help with what?
help both
Oh,
parties,
yeah.
like both the consumer and the sell, or like the state that obviously profits or could profit if you don't have to use it all, use some of it on, as you said, prevention and
Yeah.
treatment and stuff like that, but make it incentivized for the state and whatnot. But I think that that's what's is probably the key to success in terms of trying to find these solutions. Is something, if you just tell them shut down all gambling sites, for example, the state's never going to agree to that because they benefit so much off the taxes, tax revenue they gain from it. So that idea you brought up to me is very interesting. I'm trying to think of something could be similar for maybe more on the gambling side, but raising it. You mentioned there's so many different ways you can not only like spend the money, but it also it deters youth from purchasing alcohol. So it's like a win-win-win in a way.
Yeah.
So that was a really really unique idea that I really liked.
Yeah, and I like your thinking about, how can we be creative to make it appealing to the state or to whatever entity is also benefiting from the sale of whatever the product is. And that's often very difficult. One thing that's difficult, especially with a state regulated product, is the people who are regulating it are also the people who are benefiting from it. And
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
is it in their best interest to regulate it in the best way possible to protect youth? No, because they're not going to. So it's a really, it can be a difficult position. If they're protecting youth the best that they can, then they're not getting the best revenue that they can. So it's a really difficult position to be in. And I'm not saying that people are, that they don't have good intentions and that they wouldn't want to protect youth, but I think it's just inherently a hard, role. You really can't do both well, I would think.
Do you guys have you done research on like maybe raising it by 10 cents, or I think you mentioned 10 cents actually impacting like youth purchasing? Because I guess from an outsider's perspective, 10 cents, 7.49, 7.59, no one really
Exactly.
makes that big of a deal
Yeah.
about it. But have you found like actual numbers maybe
Yeah. Yeah.
to support that?
And I don't
Yeah.
have them off the top of my head, unfortunately.
Yeah,
But
yeah, that's
we're
fine. That's
we're
fine.
very fortunate. We have another alcohol researcher at Boston University who he and his research team did a report about alcohol health and safety in Massachusetts. I think it was in 2022 it was released. It was like the first report done in maybe ever or in years about the impact of alcohol in Massachusetts. And I believe in that report, he projected, what it might look like for underage use. But I can certainly get you more specifically that information. But like I said, we know from the research and from other states, that have done it in the past, that their underage drinking rates did go down when the pricing.
Excuse me.
No problem.
Sorry. Um, I guess shifting. I'm not sure how familiar you are with like the gambling or prevention movement, I guess you could call it. But do you have any like tips to maybe to skip, or I guess like things to avoid that weren't able to work, like going straight to the policy regulators, like in a bill, or any way, or any things that took some time that you think could be skippable, I guess.
Do you mean like steps that the gambling prevention movement could skip over, or that?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Or like I don't know if you were like if you guys had some, let's say you went to a policymaker with a bill to do blank, and they were just like, no, that's not possible, or something like that. Um, like any big like warning signs, I
Yeah,
guess, that you would say
yeah,
like avoid.
yeah. Well, so we're not. So the youth, who do the work are not lobbying for a specific bill. They are educating their legislators. So I just wanted to clear,
Okay, my bad,
make
my
no. I
bad.
just wanted to make that difference. Now they could lobby. There are ways. Again, this is a whole other podcast about lobbying versus advocacy, but it's possible, but oftentimes youth are funded through grant money or other funds or municipalities that would restrict, them talking and advertise, lobbying for a specific bill. However, they can do a lot of other things around that issue that's perfectly great and fine and acceptable. But to answer your question, I think that what you don't want to skip over, I know you're asking what you can skip over, but what you
No,
don't
yeah,
want to
it's fine.
skip over is information, as much information as you can gather about the decision maker that you're speaking with. So you want to go in there very well informed about how that legislator has voted on public health issues or adjacent, topics
Yeah,
in
yeah.
the past. Who is in their sphere of influence? So who do they listen to? Check campaign, check the lobbyists, and who's given money to their campaigns, because sometimes you'll see, like, you have colleagues who, like, the tobacco industry has given money, or the alcohol, and that may give you a hint. It's not set in stone. They might do something differently, but you just want to be well informed about how have they voted, who's funding their campaigns, because those industries of addiction, like alcohol and gambling and nicotine, all have a ton more money than we do or than youth do,
Yeah, yeah.
to lobby. And so, and they can be there every day of the week. They don't have school, so they can have a huge impact on legislators.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say, make sure you are well informed before you go in. Practice, get that recipe for what's the data say, what's my experience in my community, and what do I want to see changed. And there's another part that we tell youth to put into it is what value are you going to connect with that legislator on, or that decision maker. So what do you think they might value? In your research and finding that out, you might like, oh, you know what, they really value family, and Massachusetts is being on the forefront of all issues in the nation. Okay, so for alcohol, for example, well, Massachusetts is falling behind in this. We're not number one in preventing alcohol harms, because look at what, and so you're making your case and tapping in to a value that legislator or that decision maker may hold. So there's this formula, and I think being prepared for those conversations would be is a good start. And but also it can be intimidating going, especially if you're going into their office on Beacon Hill and you haven't been there before. You just have to remember, like, you're a future voter, that you're a future constituent. They want to hear your voice. They work for you, and you are there to share your thoughts, opinions, share the science, and so yeah, I think that's sort of what I would make sure to do. You don't want to go in there and be like, oh, I didn't know you sponsored this bill. That you
Yeah,
want to
yeah.
make sure you're well informed and well prepared going in.
Away from like the policy side, what do you think, like, parents, I guess, in a closer setting, away from trying to go big and go for these big, maybe policymakers that you mentioned, maybe intimidating to a lot of kids or parents listening. What do you think people can do, like the household? I know with alcohol it might be a little more visible. You can see it in people's eyes or attitude sometimes, but especially with gambling, it's quite difficult to discover because it's so invisible and on your phone, and parents don't know a lot of the times. With alcohol, I would say it's similar. I guarantee you, most parents don't know their kids go drink sometimes. So, what would you say are good steps to take in like a household setting? I guess.
Yeah. One thing we always tell parents. So we've gone from, like, just to frame this, we've gone from like population level policy, environmental change, to talking about
Mm-hmm.
as an individual, what can
Mm-hmm.
individual parents do?
Mm-hmm.
And all of those levels are important. And when we work in prevention in communities, we're trying to do a little bit at every single one of those. There's a one in between too, where you're working with a smaller group of people, but you're trying to affect change at every single level. So at this individual level, for parents and caregivers, one first thing we remind parents and caregivers is that, whether their kid is 4 or 16 or 18 or 22, you are still the biggest influence in their life. May not seem it when they're spending a lot of time with their friends. Parents are still the number one influence in their kid's life. And the other thing we always encourage is to have parents talk early and talk often about alcohol, drugs, gambling, anything, any of those like
Mm-hmm.
important topics, as to normalize it, even when
Okay.
they're younger, just to normalize, you kids, 4 or 5 year olds. I was walking in the street, and we had a convenience store that just got a beer and wine license, and so the advertising is plastered. They're covering the posts that the cement posts they put up so cars can't crash through the window. They have alcohol ads covering those, and I saw a 3 or 4 year old kid holding his dad's hand, going in and saying, "What's that?" Like asking, seeing the alcohol, because it was right at that level, the eye level of a 3 year old. So anyway, my point is that kids as young as 3 and 4 are exposed to substances, and opening up that conversation, being open, and talking early, and at multiple stages throughout their life is going to be super important. There's great information on Partnership for Drug Free, toolkits for parents, conversation starters, how to answer tough questions. There's a ton of resources online that would provide great tips and tricks for parents. But I think the key message is talk early, talk often. You are an influence on your child at every age and stage, um, and then also reach out for help if you feel like something's become a problem. Obviously, a pediatrician first is a great way to start, but then there's all Massachusetts has great resources for supporting young people with substance use disorder.
That's great advice. First of all, for like the parents, I definitely think talking is a big thing, and making it so it's not like like a taboo topic,
Mm-hmm.
in like the household. What do you think about, or do you have any tips for maybe, you know, teenager on teenager type of conversations, right? Um, I guess like prevention or like education that way is
Yeah.
something more difficult. Obviously this podcast is trying to help with that, but just telling someone straight up, like giving them a whole speech face to face is sometimes difficult for kids, and it's not taken so well. So I don't know if you have any tips on that end, or if you ran across any things that's worked, especially working with a lot of youth.
Mm. Are you saying presentations from adults or teachers to kids isn't great? What were you saying?
No, I'm saying it can work, but I'm saying like if a kid was listening to this, for example, like let's
Yeah.
say they're 14 and they're
Yeah.
seeing their
Yeah.
peers drink or
Yeah.
gamble,
Yeah.
what would you tell them to do?
Yeah.
Uh, you
Hmm.
know what I mean?
So, uh, there are a couple of things. One, a few things come to mind. First of all, there is a misperception that everybody's drinking, right? There's a misperception. Everybody vapes. When you tear that apart, when you look at the data, that's not true. Most kids are not drinking. Most kids are not vaping. Most kids are not using cannabis. And most kids aren't gambling. Now, is there a disturbing amount of kids? Too many kids are doing it because, we want to
Hmm.
protect the health and well-being of all the kids. But when it comes to peer-to-peer interactions, or somebody listening and be like, well, this is, everybody's doing it, there's no way you're going to stop it, kind of thing. That's not true. In fact, alcohol use among young people across the country has gone down over the years. And so it is possible to change. And it's also, something, it's a behavior for alcohol anyway, that most kids, for all of those, but we're talking about alcohol right now. Most kids aren't using alcohol. And so what I think is interesting is to break down that perception. Like, why do we have, where is that perception? What's that coming from? And there is a prevention strategy you can use that uses marketing called a social norms campaign, which basically it says the social norm is that misperception that everybody's doing it. But actually we flip that and show people the data and say, and youth are the messengers again. Most people don't. Most people aren't. And then you focus on, well, what are they doing? And focus on a positive, campaign of like, ABC high school kids, like to, I don't know, just whatever else they do, play pickleball or, go bowling. Most kids go bowling would rather go bowling than drink alcohol, that kind of, so you're promoting positive behaviors, but you're promoting truthful positive behaviors. You will have done that survey or that research to say, okay, what do kids value at that school? If it's not drinking, what is it? What positive thing is it? So, and that's a whole campaign, but it's been very effective in changing the culture around alcohol use or cannabis use. I can't think of a gambling example in Massachusetts anyway, off the top of my head, but certainly, actually, that's not true. Well, they had a campaign. It wasn't a social norms campaign, but it was a marketing campaign. Which is different. Social norms uses the actual data behind who's using and what percentage of people think everyone's using. So it's more specific. But anyway, that's one thought to your question. The other is peer-to-peer education is proven to be very effective, not just because it's your peer giving you this information and you're a trusted messenger. But it's also engaging those peer leaders in training and educating them it helps protect them from any negative health outcomes too, or negative, use or substance use. So it's twofold. It helps the population that they're presenting to, and it helps, the group doing the education.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you brought up the point that there's a big misconception, I guess, that everyone, I was thinking 75% of people drink, but then I just did a quick Google search. I don't know how accurate this is, but it says it's around 22% for high schoolers, which still seems a little high, but no, I think in the U.S.
In the U.S., okay.
I assume Massachusetts is probably lower, especially with the whole education, higher education rates and stuff like that, but 22% is,
I can't remember Massachusetts off the top of my head, but it's usually I want to say 84 to 87 maybe percent don't. So it might be a little lower.
13, 16, yeah. But, I guess gambling, this percentage seems very very wide, but 60 to 80% is the one that comes from the National
that don't do it?
Council on Problem Gambling. That do.
Yeah.
But gambling comes in many different forms, so I'm assuming they track, maybe a fantasy football league where you put in $10 or stuff like that. So maybe on DraftKings, it's probably much lower. A specific platform. Yeah,
you really want to, when you get data about use, you really want to dig down to see what type is it? Where are they accessing? How are they accessing? Where is it happening? This is for any, public health issue or whether it's a substance or gambling. Where is it happening? Who's it affecting the most? Because those strategies to support, either intervene or prevent future generations in that sort of subgroup may differ depending on who's most affected by a certain type of gambling. So for example, say you have data that shows that your high school boys grades 11 and 12 who identify as white have the highest rates of, and they're all in sports, have the highest rates of this type of gambling. Then you've got your subpopulation right there that may need some direct intervention and then some prevention efforts. So it's important to really scrutinize the data. And the other thing I will say about scrutinizing is the organizations that have say that they're about prevention. Because oftentimes when you look, and I'm not saying this about anything we've mentioned today, but I'm just saying about doing our due diligence, is some places will say, oh, we're the national prevention something on something, and they're actually funded by the industry themselves. And so what they're putting out for what's effective prevention is actually not backed by the science. And instead, it's in some way that's what we talked about before, being in that uncomfortable position of like, oh, I'm benefiting, but I'm also trying to prevent. They're only trying to benefit, these organizations I'm talking about. But it's really good as you embark on your educating yourself about these issues, is to really dig into when you stumble upon organizations, to really see how they're funded, and just kind of scrutinize.
You bring up like funding. Obviously, these companies, alcohol companies, gambling companies especially, really do fund, not only these organizations that you say, or that you mentioned online, but also like big celebrities and ads and stuff like that. Well, I guess what keeps you going, obviously after the podcast name, the odds are against you significantly, I guess from a financial standpoint. From my understanding, these companies have a lot more money in terms of, persuading, legislators or funding different companies. So, with a battle so difficult, I guess what's your motivation to continue to fight?
That's a good question. I still work and have a colleague that I've known for a long time, and he's sort of been a history buff, and I'm sure this is in a book somewhere too, but he sort of shared with me and recognized these, and this has been studied, these sort of waves around loosening alcohol regulations. And so I know historically, after significant national events or world events, sometimes we'll see an increase in alcohol use, and then there'll be a tipping point where it's so harmful, families are harmed, people, it's just, there's people feeling the effect of loosening, of decreasing the price, of making it more available, of doing all these things. And so then there's a tightening, and then it kind of goes down. And so that's just kind of been the historical way in which, for alcohol anyway, it's been. So on the plus side, we've seen the benefits when we put good protective policies in place, and we change hearts and minds of decision makers, or put in office decision makers who have that lived experience and know what it's like, and also understand how we can change it. So I guess the short answer to your question, I know I've seen it, I've seen it done, through history and in recent history and otherwise. And also, I mean, when youth get behind it and it comes from them, that, like, I'm always going to have hope for that. Like, that is absolutely what's going to make change, when youth, are gathering together about one topic, and sharing that, because as young people, they may not have a lot of power on paper, not be able to vote, not be able to make a ton of money, whatever, have a lot, going against them in that way or in terms of power. But the power that they do have is the experience they're living, growing up in the community that they are, the state that they are, and their voice. And like I said, our research shows youth are one of the most effective messengers when it comes to these issues. And I know I mentioned something about workforce development, but also I've worked with a number of young people as teenagers who are now somehow in the public health field. It's shaped what they've decided to do with their life. So there'll always be hope for that, especially when youth are involved in the issue.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Just focusing, I guess, on wins every single fill in the blank timeline. For me, like maybe something as small as getting like an email about like how the episode changed, how they thought about something like that. Even though it's not meaningful, like on a big, the how the new state law just changed or something really massive. Just seeing something positive every day, I guess, is definitely a good way to stay committed. If you're okay, maybe start to wrap it up, unless you want to share anything else. But I have a couple final questions. If that's okay
Yeah,
with you.
sure.
So one is like, whether it has to do with marketing or something else. What would you tell, or one thing to tell to parents, I guess, and then one to kids?
About marketing.
Marketing or anything else,
Yeah.
like just anything like unknown or something
Yeah.
like that.
So I think the best antidote for marketing on the individual level, or in a classroom or otherwise, it, as a parent, or a caregiver or an adult who spends time with young people, is to help them develop those critical thinking and criticism of anything that they see in their world, especially when it comes to advertising. So it's called media literacy, as a topic. Some schools may teach it. Certainly something easy to do at home, like when I told you about the three or 4-year-old kid who recognized an alcohol ad and asked what that is. Like, it can start as young as that. And something I ask my own kids when we see an ad and it's kind of like blatant or funny or whatever, and I said, what are they selling? And like, oh, they're selling, I don't know, vapes or whatever. They're selling, beer. I'm like, no, what are they selling? And like, oh, they're selling sex, they're selling fun, they're selling happiness, they're selling a feeling of, a value, right? Now, a culture. So really teaching kids to pick apart the advertising that they see, whether it's a poster, whether it's on the T, whether it's on their phone, whether it's a commercial on TV. So that's called media literacy. And that there have been studies to show that has been effective in helping reduce the effects of advertising. So parents and caregivers can play a role in that, and youth can play a role in that. They can hold themselves accountable for making sure that they're picking apart these ads that they see. And that can be applicable to any market, right? It can be the energy drinks, or it can be anything, because everybody's always trying to market. And in fact, the marketing rules, if you're a marketing exec, is exactly what we talk about when we talk about alcohol advertising. It's accessibility, affordability, availability, so making sure it's everywhere, making sure it's easy to get, making sure you're advertising the cheap price, and that's what marketing, companies do. So, and those are all the things that we teach people about that to be to address in order to impact alcohol policies.
And then one more of a, dream, I guess, question. If you could get one, I guess, let's go realistic policy passed tomorrow in term or for alcohol, what would that be?
Um, I'm gonna let you inspire me with that one, Connor. I think maybe the cost one is doable. I think, like you said, it can be a win-win-win. It can be reduce the harms. It can be a revenue for the state. It's not gonna break the back of the people, the consumers. The people who drink the most alcohol are the ones who have the most money. Um, so, and I think that's totally doable. Other states have done it.
Yeah, I definitely think it's doable because as we mentioned before, it's not like a big burden on anyone's
Mm-hmm.
end.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, that's about all I got. If you want to add anything, other than that, maybe let the listeners know where they can find your coalition's work or get involved in prevention on their own. So any, I guess, shout outs if you
Yeah,
want to
absolutely.
drop some information.
Yeah, if you live listening in this to this and you live in a community, definitely do a quick search for a prevention coalition. I know the Massachusetts Bureau of Substance Addiction Services has a map of all the sort of registered prevention coalitions with them. And if you live in and around Wakefield, love to hear from you. You can find us on the Town of Wakefield website. Our coalition's called Wake Up, the Wakefield Unified Prevention Coalition. And we'd love to hear from you.
Well, thank you so much, Liz. It was great having you on, and I really appreciate you taking out a good hour of your time today to come on here and share your wonderful insights.
Thanks for inviting me, Connor. It was fun.
All right.